We now have the next speaker in Ambassador Dore Gold, the president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. He's obviously someone with great experience. I had the good fortune of meeting you, Ambassador Gold, at the Derasat conference in Bahrain. And I'm aware of all the work that you do as one of Israel's senior-most former diplomats, recognized scholar. You headed the Israeli Foreign Ministry as well, apart from representing it at the United Nations. And I'm sure you have many things to say, including a response to some of the things that previous speakers have just said. So over to you, Ambassador Gold. Floor is yours. 15 minutes, if possible. Thank you.
There is something interesting about appearing at a conference like this. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, for creating an Israeli role. I think today we are fully engaged in the world system much more than we ever were before. And that's a very positive development. It is also a positive development that our normalization agreements have emerged with Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, with Sudan, and with Morocco. And this is just the beginning, and I hope it goes much further. We had a visit to Jerusalem of the foreign minister of India several months ago. And in the diplomatic protocol, it's a nice thing to provide some kind of gift which a senior politician can bring home with him. And we have a section of my research institute which deals in old photographs. And we found a photograph of Indian cavalry coming into the gates of Jerusalem with General Allenby, the commander of British forces, looking at the entrance of these troops. And the photograph reminds you of the important Indian role in what you might call regional stability back at the time, the end of World War I. And so I, of course, gave the foreign minister the photograph. It made my point. And it turns out, of course, that India's role across the Middle East region was huge. We often call it the British Empire, but the role of India in stabilizing Mesopotamia and in the agreements that the British viceroy in India had with the many states of the Persian Gulf, that role was critical. And the question, of course, that arises is India going to return to have a role? Is it going to be the same role? I doubt it. But it's something one should be aware of because a role is a reflection of interests. Today in the Gulf region, there's a very large Indian community in the millions. And I'm sure Indian governments feel a sense of responsibility in protecting these people. Now, it's no secret that we in Israel have a difficult relationship with the Iranians, which we did not seek. Let me stress, we did not seek that difficult relationship. But if you study the statements made by the Iranian leadership, you reach the conclusion that it is an extremely hostile attitude towards the state of Israel. And what it does is it requires us to prepare for what Iran may be doing. Now, everyone is talking about the Iranian nuclear program and the role of the JCPOA in perhaps addressing it. I don't think it addresses it adequately. But the other side of the Iranian role in our region is Iran's support for insurgency organizations, largely Shia militias, that have been active across the entire region. One of the unfortunate, and I stress unfortunate, consequences of the last JCPOA from 2015 was that when sanctions were lifted from Iran, the money that became suddenly available for the Indian treasury, for the Iranian treasury, that money went to these insurgency organizations. And it led to an escalation of violence. It led to an escalation of the number of organizations that were challenging the previous status quo. And of course, we had to deal with Hezbollah. We had to deal with Hamas, both of which received direct Iranian support. And our southern neighbors, the Saudis, had to deal with a huge escalation by the Houthi forces in Yemen, including missile and rocket attacks, not on military sites, but on civilian sites, including the center of their capital, Riyadh. So we have had an enormous instability introduced beginning in 2015 by Iranian-backed militias. And any resolution to the conflict in the Arabian Peninsula is going to have to address that challenge. You know, we do not have diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia, but we understand what they are facing because we face it all the time in a different form, whether it comes from Hamas or in the past when it came from Hezbollah. So I'm hoping that our stabilization of the Middle East region will include an effort to come to some solution to this challenge that we all face. Let me just say that that challenge is not just limited to the areas that border Israel. People often ask, how is it that Morocco, which is off on the Atlantic coast, how did Morocco become part of the Abraham Accords? And the factual background of Moroccan participation in this alignment in the Middle East occurred because the Iranians were supporting directly. The Iranians were supporting directly the forces belonging to the in the Western Sahara through the Iranian embassy in Algiers. And therefore, they became identified by the Moroccans as a source of regional instability in North Africa. So these are the regional circumstances that we all faced. And we're hoping that we can bring about a change in Iranian behavior, a change in the behavior of these various insurgency organizations. And with the stability that could result, we are hoping that we can create a different order for the Middle East. With respect to India, India was a great power back at the time of World War I, even though we still had the shadow of the British Empire over us. And India remains, in fact, its role is growing as a great power in the Middle East, in the protection of Indian interests, not in the protection of Israeli interests or any other interests. So these are the facts of what is going on now in our region. And there is no way to avoid the reality of India's very important role, which we respect. And we hope through dialogue, we can present each other with what we are learning about the risks to our vital interests that are becoming ever evident in the current situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Gold, for your remarks. You also raised very important points, but it strikes me as fundamental that there is no complete security for any nation at the cost of incomplete security for others. So this is some food for thought here, because when we seek absolute security for ourselves, it is likely that it is fraying the absolute security of some others. So I wonder if security can be properly defined, equally divided. Is it divisible? Is it something that transcends what we call Westphalian notions of boundaries? And we are seeing it unraveling in Europe. We have seen it for long, unraveled over decades in the Middle East. And there is potential unraveling in the decades to come in the Indo-Pacific, or more particularly in the space that is now increasingly sought to be dominated by China. So I think we need to get into the basics of the notion of security, and whether this security is merely military security, whether it is economic security, whether it is health security today, healthcare, because the COVID pandemic has shown to us that there is no security of any kind without everybody being fully vaccinated. So, beggar thy neighbor policies don't work. Unilateralism in healthcare doesn't work. And any attempt to have absolute security for oneself without the same being available to others is also something that falls short of what we call, sort of global development and progress. But thank you for those perceptive remarks. I now turn to Ambassador Gold. Would you like to step in and address some of the questions? I'll have a quick second round as well. Go ahead, please, Ambassador Gold.
Yes, I just want to make one very simple point, and that is, look, the Middle East has become much more complicated, but that doesn't mean that we all have to pull back and not comment on how the region is evolving. I believe that the Middle East is obviously in some places very explosive, and it requires, if we talk about a new world order or a new regional order, it is a consensus among all of us that certain behavior of countries is unacceptable and certain behavior of countries should be promoted. Now, the problem we have with Iran is not because we want to impose ourselves on the region. It's what we hear from our various partners in normalization. They face the same problem. They face a problem which might even be worse, because we have a very strong deterrence posture when Hezbollah operates against us. But other countries don't necessarily. And that's why I think we have to share our impressions. I'll tell you this, I opened up a channel to a Saudi think tank in 2015, and we met in Rome, Italy. And I laid out Hezbollah's strategy to the Saudis. And at first, they didn't really want to hear about it. But over time, they understood that this could be applied against them through the Houthis in Yemen. And that's exactly what happened. So what I am suggesting is that we have to draw this fundamental distinction in international diplomacy between countries that engage in aggression and countries that engage in defense. And what we are finding is that the aggressors are still out there. The aggressors will undermine our stability and our security. And if together we take a common position, we can limit the latitude of the aggressors to undermine us. And I think that would make a great contribution to international stability. And I say that as a former ambassador of Israel to the United Nations. That's it.
Ambassador Gold, did you not want to say something about that question that was posed, whether the Abraham Accords and the recognition and normalization by Arab countries, does that enhance security? What is your threat perception, etc.? There was a question that had come in. So
I'll briefly address that. Look,
okay.
I mentioned already that I discovered when I was engaged in the diplomacy with Moroccans that Morocco faced a problem of Iranians who were using their relations with Algeria to undermine the security of Morocco through the Western Sahara. And therefore, if we created this overarching concept of the Abraham Accords, it might help them because it would make the Iranian initiatives in the Western Sahara radioactive, so to speak. And I think that's what we have to do. So
okay,
that
while I
is
have you,
my,
sorry, Ambassador, to interrupt you, but actually there's something more, for you to comment on, and I'll just bring it out for you. Dr. Adil Rashid wants to know, he says some Israeli leaders believe that diplomatic relations with Pakistan should be established, as that could serve as a bridge between Israel, the Arab world, and perhaps even Iran. How do you view such a proposition? And has there been any progress in this regard? This is for you to comment on, but I can tell you that Pakistan or its leaders would pay a very heavy price if they even attempted something like that, because the manner in which they have played up, the sort of Islamic identity over the years, and a kind of dyed in the wool kind of identity, and trying to sort of propose action on what you might call so-called Islamic issues and causes. This would no doubt be detrimental to the future of any politician there, or to the credibility of the army that has oriented itself on such issues. So, but anyway, that's the question for you. Would you like to comment on that? And also, while you are at it, what is the impact of the India, Israel, UAE, USA Quad on the Israel-China relationship? Because it was brought out that, you do have a close relationship with China, and Ambassador Talmiz Ahmed suggested that not just Israel, but the UAE is not likely to take any action or play ball in regard to doing anything detrimental to China's interests. So what's your take on that?
Let me answer the second question, and you'll remind me of the first. Look, China is a country, because it is a great power, which we should have relations with. A number of years ago, I was invited by the Central Committee of the Communist Party to give a series of lectures in Beijing. And I quickly understood the gap that was opening between Israel and China. And my questions at these meetings was very simple. If we are working hard to improve our bilateral relations, how come you don't do anything in return? How is it, and I say that as a former ambassador to the UN, that you vote consistently for anti-Israel resolutions that have no basis in fact? And don't you think you should try and improve that? Well, the Chinese were not interested, of course. And I saw that we had a very big problem with them. We also know from our recent history that the Iranian nuclear program began with the transfer of Chinese technology to Iran. So these are fundamental issues, and I don't see how we resolve them quickly. I think it's important to, again, find allies and know who your allies are. And India is an ally of Israel. And we will respond to that special relationship in a special manner.
And not just that, Ambassador Gold, you brought about the Chinese role in proliferation, but it's not just with regard to Iran. You have the prime example of Pakistan, and then you also have the example of North Korea. Whichever way you look at it, that loop is really one. China, Pakistan, North Korea.
Iran is threatening to erase Israel from the map. Pakistan is not. But I wouldn't go running after a relationship with Pakistan as long as Pakistan is hostile to an important ally like India.
Meena Singh Roy, Dr. Meena Singh Roy. For Israel, Iran remains a major challenge. How do you think the new initiative of bringing Egypt, Bahrain, UAE, and Morocco will address the regional security challenges? I mean, essentially, how do you see your security vis-a-vis Iran in the future? Yeah, it appears that the two are, in a sense, as was suggested by speakers, viscerally, opposed to the other. So we have a problem there.
Are you addressing that to me?
Yes,
to
yes.
Gold?
Yes, please.
I don't understand the question really. Just stay strong, use deterrence, and try and show understanding for the ideas of the other side. But listen, I study Iranian statements. I put in my think tank a group together to study the fatwas that are coming from Iran with respect to the Jewish people, with respect to the state of Israel. And we have to understand who we're dealing with.
But do you think the people of Iran view Israel the same way? Or is it just something to do with the regime? See, these days, everything has something to do with the regime. People ask this question, would China follow the same aggressive policies if it were a different leader and not Xi Jinping? People wonder if it was someone else other than President Putin, would he have done what he did in Ukraine? So we know that since the Islamic Revolution in Iran, there is a certain view of the region, of core issues, and particularly Israel and its very existence. Would that be the same in this great age of uncertainty and flux? Do you see any change?
Many of us believe that the Iranian people are ultimately friendly to the state of Israel and to the Jewish people. We even follow the doctrines of Shia Islam. And, we have had very positive relations with Shia, for example, in southern Lebanon and the state of Israel. So I don't think that we want to paint all Shiites with the same paintbrush as hostile to us. This comes from Ayatollah Khomeini and his various doctrines, which influenced an elite, which, by the way, includes the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. And it presents a challenge to our security. It presents a challenge to the security of Bahrain, of UAE, Saudi Arabia, and many other countries. And let them clarify what their doctrine is. If their doctrine is hostile to us, at least we know what we're dealing with.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Ambassador Dore, do you have anything to say? Because
well,
I don't want to leave you with the idea that I didn't give you a chance to respond.
You are very fair, and I appreciate your sense of justice. Let me say one sentence. A few years ago, I had to have eye surgery, and I went to Hadassah Hospital to have that done. My doctor was a Palestinian Arab trained in Jordan. And the eye, which is the most sensitive part of your body. If you think of where you're going to have surgery, do you want to really have your eye operated on by someone who belongs to a national grouping that might be hostile to you? It shows the confidence that we really have in each other. And if you go to Hadassah Hospital and you go to the emergency room, and when you come to Israel, I'll take you there personally, you will see Palestinian doctors taking care of Jewish patients and Jewish doctors taking care of Palestinian patients. And those who use the word apartheid, against Israel may be very fashionable at Berkeley, Amherst, or at Cambridge, but they are totally distorting the reality that we live. And my eyes attest to that. So I'm stopping with this comment, and I ask you to study the issue before you speak on it.
Thank you very much. Let us end on that general positive note.